Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here at Heavenward Thinking. Today, we're continuing on our story about Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're starting off with God rescuing Lot here in Genesis chapter 19. So I'm going to read it and we'll dig into our study today. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands, and brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of their place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered, so the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. So we see here in this chapter, we see the beginning of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We talked about it last week, about God looking at the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah and saying that he was going to bring destruction on it because their sin had reached his ears, their outcry against their sin. And we talked about how serious God takes sin. And it's something we've been talking about from the beginning, where we started from the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. And we've continually seen the effects of sin, and we've continually seen how God deals with sin. Here we see that God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but he finds mercy on Lot. And we set the stage multiple weeks back when we talked about Lot choosing the land he wanted to go to and how he went towards where Sodom and Gomorrah was. And we said that he made the wrong choice. He ended up being somewhere and getting captured because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then again here we see he's still in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. We see that he is in a city full of complete wickedness. So much so that when he has these 2 angels with him as guests, that all the men of the city, it says every single one of them, from the young to the old, every last one, surrounded his house and tried to beat it down so that they could do inappropriate and ungodly things to these men who were actually angels. And so we see just the increase of wickedness and what that does, and how being around wickedness has problems. It affects us greatly, and we end up being in terrible places when we surround ourselves with unbelievable wickedness. That's why as Christians we're called to be in the world but not of the world. We don't want to be so surrounded by wickedness, surrounded by all the things of the world, that we become trapped, like we find Lot and his family here. We find that they were trapped in the wickedness, just as so many of us are trapped in our day-to-day lives when we let the world surround us, and when we let it entangle us and tempt us to sin, and just we give in to what the world wants. And that is a serious problem, as we see here in this chapter demonstrated for us in the Old Testament, we see that sin has effects on all of us, and being around the presence of sin leads us to places like this, where Lot had to be miraculously rescued by God before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's a warning for us to take sin seriously, make sure that we're not surrounding ourselves with wickedness. We're supposed to be the light of the world. We're supposed to go out into the dark world and witness to people and share the light of Jesus to people. Doesn't mean we need to hide and never go out and never reach people, but we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we don't let wickedness start to surround us and trap us as we're trying to witness to other people. And we should be bringing people into the light, not getting ourselves trapped in the darkness, just as Lot was here. So that's important to understand in that. And then we can see here another thing of the mercy of God, the great mercy that he is showing towards Lot again and again throughout the story of Abraham and Lot. We've seen that God takes mercy constantly upon Lot, because he's always doing it in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet God continually provides a salvation way for him to get out of the situation he's in each time. And this is definitely his worst situation he's been in yet, and yet God gives him a warning, tells him to leave. He tells him to get his sons-in-laws and his daughters and all of them to leave the city. Unfortunately, we see that even though the sons-in-laws were warned by God to leave this place, they didn't believe Lot when Lot relayed the message that God had given him. They didn't respond the way that we would like to have seen them respond. They didn't decide to leave the city, and so they decided to stay. And we see that that ended up with their destruction when we see God destroying Sodom in the next passage. So it's important that when we get a message from the Lord that we respond to that. We've talked about that a bit here on the show from the beginning. It's important to respond to what God is doing and to what God is calling us to and to what God is telling us. When he sends us a message, often through his word, guiding us in a direction, and we go the opposite way or we refuse to respond to God's message, that leads us to destruction. It leads us to bad places, just like Lot's son-in-laws. So we can see in this story so many different pieces, so many different foreshadowings of later characters in Scripture, and even in our own lives, relatable, applicable points, because we can see here ourselves in the story. At many different times, we are just like these sons-in-laws, where we refuse to listen to what God is calling us to do. When God says to go, we refuse and we stay, and that leads to terrible situations. So I would encourage you this week to look for how God is calling you in your life. Make sure you're following after the Lord, not yourself, not the wickedness of the world. Make sure you're pressing on toward what God is calling you to. And then we see here the other response to God's message, where Lot and his family do leave. They do follow the angels, albeit a little stubbornly, where they actually have to take them by the hands and lead them out of the city. But they do eventually respond. We'll see that it didn't happen great for Lot's wife. She did look back, and there were problems for that. But we see that they responded in a different way than Lot's sons-in-laws, and that led to them being saved as opposed to being destroyed with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So that is some great points of application here from this. There's lots of different things in this story. We tend to just pass over the story because it's a little not so fun to listen to, not so fun to read. There's some things that we don't like in it, but it just shows us how important it is to follow after the Lord and not be caught up in sin, not be entangled in sinfulness and darkness, because we really see here in Sodom and Gomorrah how important God's response to sin is, and how important our response to sin is, that we need to be avoiding sin and not just getting ourselves caught up in sin. We need to be right with the Lord and not just living on our own in our own wickedness. So I'd encourage you to look at this story, read it, really see how you can make it applicable to your life, because it is very applicable to each and every one of us, as we've talked about the past couple of weeks. And then next week, we will be talking about how God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and what Lot's wife did and how we should not try to be like Lot's wife. So I hope you've been encouraged by this episode, and you'll join us next time for another episode on From the Beginning here at Heavenward Thinking.